The cattle car shuddered to a halt somewhere in eastern France, and Greta Hoffmann pressed her forehead against the cold metal wall, trying to steady her breathing. The darkness inside was absolute except for thin streams of autumn light that cut through the gaps between planks. She could hear the other women shifting, their breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged the frigid air. Someone was crying softly in the corner. Someone else was praying. Greta did neither. She had stopped crying 3 weeks ago when the Russians had come through Berlin. She had stopped praying long before that. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Do you think they'll separate us?" whispered Ilse, pressed against Greta's right shoulder. Ilse was 19, barely old enough to have worn the gray uniform of the Women's Auxiliary Corps before everything collapsed. Her voice still carried traces of Hamburg's maritime accent, soft vowels that reminded Greta of fog rolling over the Elbe. "I don't know," Greta answered, though she suspected they would. She suspected many things, none of them comforting. The journey from the Russian zone had been 23 days of confusion, transfers, hostile faces, and the constant gnawing certainty that whatever came next would be worse than what came before. They were not soldiers, not exactly, but they had worn the uniform. They had served the regime, in the eyes of the world, that made them complicit, and Greta had long since stopped trying to argue otherwise, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. The train lurched forward again, then stopped with a metallic screech that set Greta's teeth on edge. Voices outside now, speaking a language she didn't immediately recognize. Not Russian, thank God, not Russian. Not French either, though they'd passed through French hands twice already. American, she realized after a moment. The drawling, confident cadence of American English filtered through the walls of the cattle car, like something from another world. "Americans," someone said in the darkness, and Greta couldn't tell if the tone was relieved or terrified, perhaps both. The door rolled open with a violence that made them all flinch, and September sunlight poured in like an accusation. Greta raised her hand to shield her eyes, squinting against the brightness. She could make out silhouettes of soldiers standing on the platform, rifles slung over their shoulders, but for several long seconds no one moved. The women stayed huddled in the car. The soldiers stayed on the platform. Time seemed suspended in that strange tableau, as if neither side could quite believe the other existed. "All right, ladies, let's go," one of the Americans said, his voice carrying an edge of weary patience. "Come on down. Nobody's gonna hurt you. Nobody's gonna hurt you." The words were so absurd that Greta almost laughed. Instead, she pushed herself forward, her legs stiff from days of sitting, and stepped toward the opening. She was 31 years old, though she felt decades older. Her blonde hair hung in greasy strands around her face, and her uniform, once crisp gray wool, was stained with mud and something darker that she tried not to think about. When she reached the edge of the car, she hesitated, looking down at the 2-foot drop to the platform. An American soldier stepped forward. He was young, maybe 23 or 24, with a sunburned face and eyes the color of the North Sea. He held out his hand. Greta stared at it. "It's all right," he said. "I got you." She looked at his face, searching for the cruelty she'd been trained to expect. The propaganda films had shown American soldiers as barbarians, as brutal as the Bolsheviks, interested only in violence and vengeance. But this boy, and he was a boy really, despite the uniform and the rifle, just looked tired. His hand remained extended, patient, waiting. Slowly, Greta reached out and took it. His grip was firm, steadying her as she stepped down onto the platform. When her feet touched solid ground, he smiled, a quick, almost apologetic expression, and then moved to help the next woman. Ilse came down beside her, then Margaret, then Frida with her twisted ankle, then old Frau Ziegler, who'd been a teacher before the war and refused to let anyone call her anything but Frau Ziegler. Even now, one by one, 53 women emerged from the cattle car into the golden light of a French afternoon, blinking like creatures unused to the sun. They huddled together instinctively, a mass of gray uniforms and dirty faces, while American soldiers formed a loose perimeter around them. "Listen up," called an officer from the front of the formation. He was older than the others, maybe 40, with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen too much. "You're being transferred to a processing facility 15 kilometers from here. You'll be transported by truck. You'll be fed. You'll be given medical attention if needed. Follow instructions, and this'll go smooth for everyone." He spoke in careful, accented German. Someone had taught him well. Greta found herself analyzing his pronunciation, noting the way he flattened certain vowels, the slight hesitation before compound words. It was something to focus on besides the fear. The trucks were waiting beyond the platform, canvas-covered transports with benches in the back. The soldiers guided them forward with gestures more than words, and Greta noticed something strange. None of them touched the women unnecessarily. When Frida stumbled on her bad ankle, a soldier steadied her by the elbow and immediately let go. When Frau Ziegler moved too slowly, another soldier simply waited, patient, making no move to hurry her along. This was not what Greta had expected. The Russians had not been patient. The Russians had been many things, but patient was not among them. She climbed into the first truck and found a seat on the bench. Ilse sat beside her, still trembling slightly. Across from them, a woman named Anna sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of careful neutrality. Anna had been a radio operator Greta knew, one of the few who'd actually worked directly with military communications. She never talked about what she'd heard, what she'd known. None of them talked much about what they'd known. The truck rumbled to life, and they began to move through countryside that looked almost obscenely peaceful. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, golden with late-season wheat. Farmhouses stood intact, their shutters painted cheerful colors. In one yard, Greta saw a woman hanging laundry while a dog played at her feet. The normalcy of it was jarring, almost offensive. How could the world look so ordinary when everything had ended? "Where do you think they're taking us?" Ilse whispered. "A camp," Greta said. "A prisoner of war camp. But we're not soldiers. Does it matter?" Ilse fell silent. In the weeks since the surrender, they'd all learned that many things that should have mattered didn't matter anymore. The distinctions they'd once relied upon, civilian versus military, guilty versus innocent, perpetrator versus witness, had collapsed into a single damning category, German. The processing facility turned out to be a converted monastery on the outskirts of a small town whose name Greta never learned. Stone walls rose up against the darkening sky, and a cross still topped the chapel, though the building itself had been repurposed into something between a hospital and a sorting station. The trucks pulled through gates topped with barbed wire, and Greta felt her stomach tighten. She'd known the wire would be there. There was always wire. But then they were climbing down from the trucks, and again there were soldiers waiting, and again they were being guided with a strange gentleness that made Greta's skin prickle with confusion. They filed into a large hall that must have once been a refectory. Long tables had been set up, and at each station sat an American soldier with a clipboard and a bored expression. "One at a time," called a lieutenant from the doorway. "State your name, rank, and unit. Answer the questions truthfully. This is just processing. Nothing to be afraid of. Nothing to be afraid of." Greta wanted to laugh again, but she swallowed the impulse. She took her place in line and waited, watching the women ahead of her approach the tables, speak in low voices, receive papers, and move on to the next station. The process seemed almost bureaucratic in its tedium, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had been violent. When her turn came, Greta approached the table and stood at attention, habit overriding her exhaustion. "At ease," said the soldier behind the table. He was writing something on his clipboard and didn't look up immediately. "Name, Greta Hoffmann. Rank, Nachrichtenhelferin. Communications assistant. Unit," she told him. He wrote it down. His handwriting was surprisingly neat. "Age, 31. Hometown, Dresden." At this, he looked up. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe, or sympathy. Dresden had been in the newspapers. Dresden had been fire and ash and horror broadcast to the world. But he didn't say anything, just nodded and made another note. "Any injuries or medical conditions we should know about?" "No," Any immediate family members we can contact? The question was routine, asked without particular emphasis, but it hit Greta like a physical blow. She stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. No, she said finally. He glanced up again, perhaps hearing something in her voice, but he didn't press. All right, move to Station 2 for your personal effects inventory. Next. Station 2 was where they catalogued what little the women had left. For Greta, it was pitifully simple. A small leather journal, a fountain pen that no longer worked, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials that her mother had given her 3 years ago, and a photograph. The soldier at this station, a corporal with red hair and freckles, handled each item with careful attention, describing it aloud as he wrote. One journal, brown leather, approximately 15 centimeters by 10 centimeters. One fountain pen, brass, non-functional. One handkerchief, white linen with embroidered initials GH. One photograph, black and white, showing. He paused, looking at the picture. Greta knew what he was seeing. A family portrait taken in 1938, before everything. Her parents standing stiff and formal, Greta herself at 18, her brother Klaus at 16. All of them dressed in their Sunday best. All of them smiling slightly as the photographer had instructed. Showing for individuals. The corporal finished quietly. He looked at Greta. You'll get all this back when you're released. When will that be? The question escaped before she could stop it. He shook his head. Above my pay grade, ma'am. I just do inventory. Ma'am. He called her ma'am. Greta carried that small, strange courtesy with her to the next station, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. By the time they'd been processed through all 6 stations, it was nearly midnight. They were exhausted, hungry, and completely disoriented. But then they were being led down a corridor to a large dormitory that had once housed monks. Rows of cots had been set up, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 gray blankets. At the far end of the room stood a table laden with bread, cheese, apples, and large metal containers that steamed in the cool air. Dinner, said the sergeant, escorting them. Coffee too, or tea if you prefer. Help yourselves. Lights out in 30 minutes. He left, closing the door behind him, and for a long moment, none of the women moved. They just stared at the food, at the beds, at the relative cleanliness of the space. It was Frau Ziegler who finally walked forward and picked up a piece of bread, turning it over in her hands as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Then she took a bite, and something in her expression crumbled. It's fresh, she said, her voice breaking. God help me, it's fresh bread. That broke the spell. The women moved forward, reaching for food with hands that shook from more than hunger. Greta took an apple and a piece of cheese, found a cot near the back, and sat down heavily. Ilse joined her a moment later, cradling a cup of coffee like it was something precious. They didn't hurt us, Ilse said softly. Not yet, Greta replied. But they could have. Greta, they could have done anything. We're prisoners. We're Germans. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. We're everything they should hate, Greta thought. We're the face of the enemy. We're complicit in horrors we can't even fully comprehend. And yet they gave us fresh bread. Across the room, Margaret was crying silently into her hands. Anna sat on her cot, staring at nothing. Frida had already fallen asleep, still clutching half an apple. They were broken women in a broken world, and none of them knew what came next. But for tonight they had beds. They had food. They had not been harmed. Greta lay back on her cot and stared at the ceiling, where shadows from the single light bulb danced across old plaster. She thought about the soldier who'd helped her down from the train, the one who'd smiled that quick, apologetic smile. She thought about the corporal who'd called her ma'am. She thought about the sergeant who'd said, help yourselves, as if they were guests rather than prisoners. She didn't understand any of it. She fell asleep trying to reconcile these kindnesses with everything she'd been taught, everything she'd believed, everything she'd feared. And in her dreams, she stood in a burning city while strangers offered her bread, and she couldn't tell if she was being saved or damned. The morning came with light filtering through tall windows that must have once overlooked a monastery garden. Greta woke slowly, her body protesting the shift from sleep to consciousness. And for a handful of heartbeats, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned. The train, the platform, the American soldiers, the fresh bread. And she pushed herself upright, her muscles aching from weeks of poor sleep and constant tension. Around the dormitory, other women were stirring. Some sat on the edges of their cots, staring at their hands. Others had already risen and stood by the windows, looking out at a courtyard where morning mist still clung to the ground. The light was soft, almost golden, and Greta found herself thinking absurdly of a painting she'd seen once in a museum in Berlin, before the war. A Vermeer, perhaps, or a Rembrandt. Something Dutch and luminous, full of domestic tranquility that belonged to another century entirely. "Formation in 20 minutes, called a voice from the doorway. Greta turned to see a woman in an American uniform, though not a combat uniform. She wore a crisp shirt and skirt, her dark hair pinned neatly back, and she carried herself with an authority that seemed born of competence rather than cruelty. "Breakfast will be served in the refectory. There are washing facilities down the hall, 4 sinks, cold water only, but there's soap. Clean uniforms will be distributed this afternoon." She spoke in excellent German, though with an accent that suggested she'd learned it formally rather than growing up with it. An interpreter, Greta guessed, or perhaps a German-American, of which there were many, all of them now caught in the same strange war that had divided families across an ocean. The washing facilities were exactly as described, for porcelain sinks in a room that still smelled faintly of incense and old stone. Greta waited her turn, then splashed cold water on her face, scrubbing away days of grime with the provided soap. It was good soap, not the ersatz lye mixture they'd been using for years, and the scent of it, clean, almost floral, brought an unexpected sting to her eyes. Such a small thing, such a stupid, small thing to make her want to cry. When she looked up, she caught her reflection in a cracked mirror hanging above the sinks. The face that stared back was gaunt, hollow-eyed, framed by hair that hung limp and dull around her shoulders. She looked like a ghost. She looked like every German woman she'd seen in the past 6 months, all of them wearing the same expression of exhausted bewilderment. "You're thinking too much," said a voice beside her. Greta glanced over to find Anna there, drying her hands on her uniform since there were no towels. "I can see it in your face. You're trying to figure out why they're being kind. Aren't you?" Anna shrugged. "I stopped trying to figure out anything months ago. Easier that way. I don't think I know how to stop. Then you'll drive yourself mad." Anna's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "They're being kind because they're Americans and Americans have always been sentimental. Or they're being kind because we're women and even in war, men have a weakness for women. Or they're being kind because they want something from us, information, cooperation, compliance. Or they're being kind because they're following orders, and their orders say to treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Pick whichever explanation helps you sleep at night." "And which one do you pick?" Anna looked at her directly. "All of them. None of them. Does it matter?" Before Greta could answer, Ilsa appeared in the doorway, her face freshly scrubbed and pink. "They're lining us up for breakfast," she said. "Come on. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse." The refectory had been transformed overnight. The processing tables were gone, replaced by long benches and tables like the ones that must have served the monks decades ago. At the front of the room, steam rose from metal serving trays, and the smell of coffee, real coffee, filled the air with an almost painful intensity. The women filed in silently, taking seats where they were directed, and then the same sergeant from the previous night stood before them. "Morning, ladies," he said in his careful German. "We'll do this cafeteria style. Form a line, take a tray and utensils. Servers will give you your portions. Eat what you want, but don't waste. Water and coffee available at the far table. Any questions?" No one spoke. "All right then. First row, let's go." Greta was in the 3rd row. She watched the women ahead of her move through the line, saw their eyes widen as soldiers spooned portions onto their trays, oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs that seemed impossibly yellow, bread with butter, even small portions of bacon. By the time it was her turn, her hands were shaking. The soldier serving didn't comment, just filled her tray and nodded her along. She found a seat between Ilse and Frau Ziegler and stared down at her food. It was more than she'd seen on one plate in 3 years. "Eat," Frau Ziegler said quietly. "Don't think. Just eat." So Greta ate. The oatmeal was warm and sweet. The eggs were fluffy and rich with butter. The bread was soft, not the dense, sawdust-laden loaves they choked down during the final months of the war. She ate slowly, mechanically, her mind strangely detached from the act of eating, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. Around her, the other women ate in similar silence. A few wept quietly, tears streaming down their faces as they chewed. Others ate with a grim determination, as if the food were medicine they had to force down. Only young Ilse seemed to eat with anything approaching pleasure, though even she kept glancing around as if expecting someone to snatch the tray away. After breakfast, they were assembled in the courtyard. The morning mist had burned off, revealing a space that must have once been beautiful. Stone pathways, raised garden beds now overgrown with weeds, a fountain in the center that no longer ran. American soldiers stood at intervals around the perimeter, rifles held loosely, their postures relaxed. One of them was smoking. Another was reading a letter, his lips moving silently as he absorbed news from home. The lieutenant who'd overseen their arrival the previous night appeared, accompanied by the woman interpreter. He waited until he had their attention, then spoke in English while the woman translated. "You're being held here temporarily while we determine your classification and next steps," she translated. "You are prisoners of war, but as non-combat personnel, you'll be treated accordingly. Your days will be structured. You'll have work assignments, laundry, kitchen duty, general maintenance. You'll have exercise periods and free time. Male privileges will be established once we've completed background checks. Medical personnel are available if needed. Rules are simple. Follow instructions, stay within designated areas, no violence, no escape attempts. Questions?" A woman near the front raised her hand tentatively. "How long will we be here?" The lieutenant listened to the translation, then shook his head. "Unknown at this time. Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on a lot of factors above my pay grade." "What about our families?" another woman called out. "Can we contact them?" "Eventually, yes, but understand that communications are complicated right now. Germany is occupied. Infrastructure is damaged. We're working on establishing proper channels, but it takes time. Are we going to be tried?" This from Anna, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. "For war crimes." The lieutenant's expression didn't change. "That's not my department. You'll be interviewed over the coming weeks. Answer honestly, cooperate, and things will go smoother. Lie or obstruct, and it'll be noted. That's all I can tell you." When the assembly ended, they were divided into work groups. Greta found herself assigned to the kitchen with 15 other women, which meant reporting to a mess hall behind the main building where 2 American cooks, both black men, which startled her more than she wanted to admit, were already at work preparing the midday meal. "Morning," said the older of the two, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a smile that creased his entire face. "I'm Sergeant Washington. This is Corporal Lewis. You ladies are going to help us prep vegetables, wash dishes, and keep this place running smooth. Any of you worked in a kitchen before?" 3 women raised their hands. "Good. You 3 work with Lewis on prep. The rest of you I'll teach as we go. First rule, we keep a clean kitchen. Second rule, we don't waste food. Third rule, you treat the food with respect because somewhere, a soldier's going to eat what you prepare, and that soldier deserves the best we can give him." "Understood." They nodded mutely. "All right then, let's get started." The work was simple, repetitive, and strangely soothing. Greta found herself at a large sink, washing potatoes while Ilse stood beside her peeling them. Sergeant Washington moved through the kitchen with an easy competence, showing them how he wanted things done, correcting mistakes with patience rather than anger. When one woman dropped a pot with a tremendous clatter, he just laughed. "Happens to everyone," he said. "Pick it up, rinse it off, keep moving. We're not going to bite you for dropping a pot." Greta glanced at him, trying to reconcile this gentle giant with the propaganda images that had saturated German media for years. Black American soldiers had been portrayed as subhuman, as monsters, as the worst of the worst. And yet here was Sergeant Washington, teaching them to cook, smiling when they made mistakes, humming something under his breath as he stirred a pot of stew. During a break, he brought them water and apples, setting them on the counter. "You ladies are doing good," he said. "I know this is strange. I know you're scared. But we're all just trying to get through this, all right? I got a daughter about your age," he added, nodding at Ilsa. "Back home in Georgia. Her name's Ruth. She wants to be a teacher." He pulled out a photograph from his pocket, a young woman in a graduation gown, beaming at the camera. "Just got this last week. She finished her degree." "She's beautiful," Ilsa said softly. "She is. She's the best thing I ever did with my life." He tucked the photograph away. "Point is, I see you ladies and I think about Ruth. I think about how I'd want someone to treat her if she was scared and far from home. So that's how I'm treating you. With respect. With decency. Because that's what humans deserve." He walked away before anyone could respond, leaving them standing by the sink with apples in their hands and tears on their cheeks. The days began to take on a rhythm. Wake at dawn. Washington breakfast. Work assignments. Lunch. More work or exercise periods in the courtyard. Dinner. Free time in the dormitory. Lights out at 10. It was almost like being in school, Greta thought, except that the teachers carried rifles and the textbooks were replaced with mops and dish soap. But slowly, gradually, something began to shift. The women started to talk more, first in whispers and then in normal conversation. They learned each other's names, their stories, the small details that made them individuals rather than a uniform mass. Greta learned that Ilsa had been studying music before the war, that she'd played violin in her school orchestra and had dreamed of performing in Hamburg's Symphony Hall. She learned that Margaret had worked in a factory making radio components, that her hands were permanently scarred from the chemicals she'd handled without proper protection. She learned that Frida had been engaged to a soldier who died at Stalingrad, that she joined the auxiliary corps because she hadn't known what else to do with her grief. And slowly, the Americans became individuals too. Sergeant Washington had his daughter Ruth and his stories about Georgia peaches and thunderstorms that rolled across red clay fields. Corporal Lewis was quiet but had a wicked sense of humor that emerged when he thought no one was listening. The lieutenant was named Patterson, and he had a photograph of a wife and baby son that he looked at every evening during his rounds. The guards rotated, but Greta learned their names. Private Miller, who was only 18 and homesick. Corporal Rodriguez, who spoke Spanish to himself when he thought no one could hear. Sergeant Burke, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand and never explained how he'd lost them. 3 weeks after their arrival, Greta was called to an interview room on the 2nd floor. She climbed the stairs with her heart hammering, expecting, what? Torture? Interrogation? The worst her imagination could conjure? Instead, she found a small office with 2 chairs, a table, and a woman in a neat uniform sitting with a notebook. "Greta Hoffmann?" the woman asked in German. "Yes, I'm Captain Brenner. I'm with Army Intelligence. This isn't an interrogation. It's an interview. I'm going to ask you some questions about your service, and I need you to answer honestly. There's no right or wrong answers here. I'm just trying to establish facts. Do you understand?" "I think so." "Good. Let's start simple. Where were you born?" And so it began. Question after question, each one mundane and yet weighted with significance. Where had she lived? Where had she gone to school? When had she joined the auxiliary corps? What had been her duties? Had she witnessed any criminal activity? Had she participated in any? Did she know about the camps? The deportations? The final solution? On that last question, Greta's hands clenched in her lap. She thought about lying. She thought about saying no, about claiming ignorance, about protecting herself with the shield of plausible deniability that so many were already attempting to raise. Instead, she said, "We heard rumors. Everyone heard rumors. But we didn't. I didn't." She stopped, swallowed hard. "I didn't want to believe them. It was easier not to believe them." Captain Brenner wrote something in her notebook. Her expression remained neutral. "Did you ever see direct evidence of these crimes?" "No. I worked in communications. I transmitted messages, maintained equipment. I never saw. I was never in the East." "But you transmitted messages that might have related to these activities?" "I don't know. The messages were coded. We weren't told what they meant." "But you could guess?" Greta looked at the captain directly. "Anyone could guess, if they wanted to." "And did you want to?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. "No," Greta admitted. "I didn't want to know, because if I knew, then I would have to decide what to do about it, and there was nothing I could do. So it was easier to just not know." Captain Brenner nodded slowly, still writing. "That's honest. I appreciate that. A lot of people aren't being honest right now. What happens now? Now I finish my report. It goes up the chain. Decisions get made by people with more authority than me. But for what it's worth, Miss Hoffmann, I don't think you're a war criminal. I think you're a woman who got caught up in something much larger than herself and made the compromises necessary to survive. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility, but it does matter." After the interview, Greta returned to the dormitory feeling hollowed out, scraped clean of something she couldn't name. That evening, she sat on her cot with her journal open on her lap, the fountain pen someone had repaired resting between her fingers. She'd been afraid to write anything since her capture, afraid that words on paper could be used against her, but now she found herself writing anyway. October 15th, 1945. "We've been here almost a month now. I don't know what to call this place. It's not exactly a prison, though we're not free. It's not exactly a camp, though there's wire around the perimeter. The Americans feed us, give us work, treat us like human beings, and I don't understand it. I was taught that they would hate us. I was taught that we deserved their hate. But every day, Sergeant Washington shares photographs of his daughter. Every day, Private Miller smiles and says good morning. Every day, we are given dignity we haven't earned. I interviewed with Captain Brenner today. She asked me if I knew, and I realized that I did know, or at least I knew enough. We all knew enough, and we did nothing. We convinced ourselves that there was nothing we could do, but maybe that was just cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. Maybe we could have done something. Maybe one person couldn't have stopped the machine, but maybe if enough of us had tried, had refused, had stood up, but we didn't. The Americans are being kind to us, and I'm not sure we deserve it. But I'm grateful for it anyway, and I think that makes me a hypocrite. I think it makes me human." She closed the journal and lay back on her cot, listening to the sounds of the dormitory around her. Ilsa humming softly to herself, Margaret coughing, Frau Ziegler saying her evening prayers in a whisper. Outside, footsteps echoed in the corridor as the night guard made his rounds. An ordinary evening in a strange sanctuary that none of them understood. That night, Greta dreamed of Dresden burning. She stood in the Altmarkt while fire fell from the sky, and American soldiers walked through the flames offering her bread. She woke with tears on her face and the taste of smoke in her mouth. The first crack in their strange sanctuary appeared on a gray November morning when a new group of prisoners arrived. Greta was working in the kitchen when she heard the trucks pulling into the courtyard, heard the commotion of new voices, the shuffle of feet on stone. Sergeant Washington paused in his work, listening, then shook his head. "More coming in," he said quietly. "God knows from where." By lunch, the dormitory had been divided to accommodate 30 additional women, and the atmosphere shifted like weather before a storm. These new arrivals were different, harder, more defiant, with eyes that held something colder than fear. They were older too, on average, and wore uniforms that marked them as having held more significant positions. Not just auxiliaries and communication assistants, but officers' aides, administrative coordinators, women who'd worked directly within the machinery of power. One of them, a woman named Hilda Richter, took over a cot near Greta's with an air of entitlement that immediately set everyone on edge. She was perhaps 45, tall and angular, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. When Frau Ziegler offered a tentative greeting, Hilda looked at her with undisguised contempt. "Don't bother with the friendliness," Hilda said. "We're not here to make friends with anyone, least of all our captors' pets." The insult landed like a slap. Frau Ziegler stepped back, her face reddening, and said nothing more. That evening at dinner, tensions escalated. The new women sat together at one end of the refectory, speaking in low, intense voices while shooting hostile glances at the guards. Sergeant Washington noticed and moved through the room with deliberate calm, refilling coffee cups and making small talk. But even his gentle presence couldn't ease the tightness in the air. It was Hilda who finally sparked the confrontation. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and pointed at a black soldier standing guard by the door. "This is obscene," she announced in German, her voice carrying through the hall. "We're being guarded by—" She used a word that made Greta's stomach turn. A racial slur she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, not since the worst of the propaganda rallies. The room went silent. Sergeant Washington set down the coffee pot he'd been holding and turned slowly to face Hilda. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "What did she say?" asked the guard by the door, Private Johnson, who was new and didn't speak German. "Nothing that matters," Washington replied in English. Then, in German, he addressed Hilda directly. "Ma'am, we treat you with respect. I expect the same in return." "Respect?" Hilda laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You want respect from us? You've destroyed our country, killed our men, and now you parade your occupation forces in front of us like we should be grateful." "We didn't start this war," Washington said quietly, "but we're trying to end it with some dignity intact. For everyone." "Dignity," Hilda spat. "You speak of dignity while you humiliate us." Lieutenant Patterson had appeared in the doorway. "What's going on here?" Washington explained briefly in English. Patterson's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, the interpreter hurrying to keep pace. "Let me be clear," Patterson said. His words translated crisply into German. "You're POWs under our custody. That means you follow our rules and you treat everyone with basic human decency. Staff, guards, fellow prisoners. No exceptions. Any further incidents of this nature will result in solitary confinement and loss of privileges. Am I understood?" Hilda glared at him but said nothing. After a long moment, she sat down, her face rigid with fury. The meal continued in uncomfortable silence, but something had been broken. The new arrivals had brought with them an unrepentant ideology, a refusal to accept the reality of their situation. And gradually, insidiously, their influence began to spread. Over the following days, Greta watched as divisions formed within the prisoner population. Some women, mostly the newer arrivals, began to resist in small ways. They took longer to follow instructions. They whispered among themselves about escape plans that were clearly fantasy but kept the flame of defiance alive. They mocked women like Greta who performed their work diligently and spoke politely to the guards, calling them collaborators and traitors. "You're making yourself comfortable in your captivity?" Hilda said to Greta one morning as they stood in line for breakfast. "Like a dog that's learned to love its cage." "I'm surviving," Greta replied evenly. "You're submitting. There's a difference." "And what would you have me do? Spit in their faces? Refuse to eat? They won the war, Hilda. That's reality. So we should just forget everything? Forget who we are." "I haven't forgotten anything," Greta said, her voice dropping. "I remember perfectly. Maybe that's the problem." The confrontation that changed everything came in late November, on a day when frost covered the courtyard stones and breath fogged in the air. Greta was in the kitchen when she heard shouting from the direction of the laundry room. She exchanged glances with Ilsa, both of them moving toward the door despite Sergeant Washington's warning to stay put. In the corridor, they found Lieutenant Patterson and two guards trying to restrain a woman who was screaming in German, her face contorted with rage. It was one of Hilda's group. Greta didn't know her name, and she was fighting like a wild animal, clawing and kicking. "He touched me," she screamed. That animal put his hands on me. A young black soldier stood against the wall, his face ashen, his hands raised defensively. Sir, I swear. She stumbled. I just steadied her. Liar. Pig. You think you can put your filthy hands on a German woman? Patterson's voice cut through the hysteria. That's enough. Private Cooper was doing his job. You're being hysterical. But the woman wouldn't stop, and now other prisoners were emerging from doorways, drawn by the commotion. Greta saw Hilda appear, saw the cold calculation in her eyes as she assessed the situation. This is what they do, Hilda announced, projecting her voice. They humiliate us. They degrade us. And when we object, we're the ones at fault. That's not what happened, Greta heard herself saying. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. Private Cooper helped her. That's all. I've seen him do the same thing a dozen times. He's gentle. Hilda turned on her with venom. Of course you'd defend them. You've been defending them since we arrived. You and all the other broken women who've forgotten what it means to have pride. Pride. Greta's voice rose despite herself. Our pride destroyed half of Europe. Our pride killed millions. Maybe a little less pride and a little more humanity would serve us better. You disgust me, Hilda hissed. The feeling is mutual. Lieutenant Patterson intervened before things could escalate further. The hysterical woman was removed to the medical facility for evaluation. Private Cooper was reassigned to a different area, and the prisoners were assembled in the refectory for an emergency meeting. Captain Brenner stood before them, her expression grave. I understand you're angry, she said, her German impeccable as always. I understand you're scared and confused and grieving everything you've lost. But let me be absolutely clear about something. We are not your enemies. We are not here to abuse you or humiliate you. We're here to process you, to determine your level of involvement in war crimes, and eventually to release those of you who weren't directly complicit in atrocities. But we cannot do that if you insist on seeing us as monsters. You are monsters, someone called from the back. You bombed our cities. You killed our children. Your government started a war that killed 60 million people, Brenner replied quietly. Your government built factories of death. Your government attempted to exterminate entire peoples. We didn't start this. We finished it. And now we're trying to build something better from the ashes. But we can't do that alone. We need you to meet us halfway. Why should we? Hilda demanded. You've already decided we're guilty. No, Brenner said. You've already decided you're victims. There's a difference. The room erupted in argument, voices rising and falling like waves. Greta sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the competing narratives. On one side, we were just following orders, we didn't know, we couldn't have stopped it, we're innocent. On the other, you're all guilty, you all knew, you all participated, you all deserve punishment. And somewhere between those extremes was the uncomfortable truth that Greta had been circling for months. They had known, and they had done nothing. They were neither purely guilty nor purely innocent. They existed in the gray space between. That night, unable to sleep, Greta found herself standing by the dormitory window, looking out at the courtyard where frost glittered under the moon. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Ilsa there, wrapped in her blanket. Can't sleep either? Ilsa whispered. Too much noise in my head. They stood together in silence for a while. Finally, Ilsa spoke again. Do you think we're bad people? Greta considered the question carefully. I think we're ordinary people who lived through extraordinary evil and made compromises to survive. Whether that makes us bad, I don't know. But I know we have to live with what we did and didn't do. And maybe that's the punishment. The Americans keep being kind to us, Ilsa said. Even after everything. Even after Hilda and the others, they just keep being kind. I know. Why? Greta thought about Sergeant Washington and his daughter Ruth. She thought about Private Miller writing letters home to his mother. She thought about Lieutenant Patterson looking at photographs of his baby son. She thought about Captain Brenner sitting across from her, asking questions not with cruelty but with careful professionalism. Because they've decided that kindness is stronger than hatred, Greta said finally. Because they've chosen to see us as human beings who made terrible mistakes rather than monsters beyond redemption. Because they're better than we were. Ilse started crying softly. I'm so ashamed. I know. So am I. They stood together until dawn, two German women in an occupied land, bearing witness to their own shame and to the unexpected mercy of their captors. And when morning came, they returned to their work, to their meals, to their structured days in a monastery that had become both prison and sanctuary. 3 months later, on a February morning bright with new snow, Greta stood in Lieutenant Patterson's office holding a piece of paper. It was her release authorization, signed and stamped, declaring her cleared of war crimes and eligible for repatriation. You'll be transported to Stuttgart, Patterson explained through the interpreter. From there, you'll go through final processing and then you'll be free to go wherever you want in the American zone. Eventually, you'll be able to return to the Soviet zone if that's where your home is, but I wouldn't recommend it yet. Things are still complicated. I understand. Greta, he paused, using her first name for the first time. I read your file. I know what you went through. I know about Dresden, about your family. I'm sorry. She nodded, unable to speak. For what it's worth, he continued, I think you're one of the good ones. I think you were caught up in something terrible and you did the best you could. That doesn't erase anything, but it matters. Does it? Her voice was hoarse. It has to. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? She left the office and returned to the dormitory to pack her few possessions. Ilse was being released too, as were a dozen others. Hilda and her faction remained, facing additional interviews and investigations. As Greta folded her blanket, Hilda appeared in the doorway. So you're leaving, Hilda said flatly. Yes. Running away to start fresh. Pretending none of this happened. Greta turned to face her. No. I'm going to spend the rest of my life remembering exactly what happened. I'm going to live with what we did and what we failed to do. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll find some way to make amends. But I won't do it by holding on to hate. She picked up her bag and walked past Hilda without another word. In the courtyard, a truck waited. Sergeant Washington was there, standing in the cold with his hands in his pockets. When he saw Greta, he smiled. Heading out. Yes, thank you. For everything. You take care of yourself, Miss Greta. You find some peace, you hear? I'll try. And maybe... He hesitated, then pulled out a piece of paper with an address written on it. Maybe someday, when things are more normal, you write to my Ruth. I told her about you ladies. She wants to be a teacher, wants to understand the world. I think hearing from you might help her understand some things. Only if you want to, of course. Greta took the address with shaking hands. I'd be honored. He tipped his cap to her and she climbed into the truck. As it pulled away from the monastery, she looked back one final time at the stone walls, the barbed wire, the cross still standing atop the chapel. It had been a prison, yes, but it had also been the place where she'd learned that mercy was possible even after atrocity, that kindness could exist even between enemies, that humanity could survive even the worst that humans could do to each other. The road ahead was uncertain. Germany was broken, occupied, struggling to understand what it had become. She had no home to return to, no family waiting for her, no clear path forward. But she had witnessed something in that monastery that she would carry with her forever. The possibility of redemption through acknowledgement, through honesty, through the slow, difficult work of facing what you'd been and choosing to become something better. As the truck carried her toward Stuttgart and an unknown future, Greta Hoffmann pressed her hand against her pocket, feeling the outline of Sergeant Washington's daughter's address. She would write. She would tell the truth. She would spend the rest of her life trying to understand how ordinary people had permitted extraordinary evil, and how other ordinary people had chosen extraordinary kindness in response. The Americans had won the war. But more than that, they had won something harder. They had maintained their humanity in the face of inhumanity. They had looked at their enemies and chosen to see human beings. Greta would spend the rest of her life trying to earn that mercy. Thank you for listening to this story about Greta Hoffmann and the unexpected kindness she encountered as a German prisoner of war. These moments of humanity amid the darkness of World War II remind us that even in our most difficult times, we have the choice to respond with either hatred or compassion.